Hello, everyone, and welcome to MedTech Innovator Live. So we are a webinar showcasing best of the best people from our ecosystem here at MedTech Innovator in different topics that are hot and popular in the MedTech space. Really excited today to have four amazing panelists on to talk all about acquired taste, what strategics really want in MedTech. So you'll hear all about how to engage with strategic partners and furthermore, how to take this down to a future acquisition in the future. So if you're listening in on LinkedIn and you have questions for these folks, we want to engage you guys because this is a live format. So pull up a seat at the table to get a taste of what really drives these acquisition decisions from some of the biggest names in the medtech industry. Really excited to be joined here today, first of all, by Matthew Shop from Zimmer Biomet. Matthew, would love to hear an introduction from you.
Thanks, Nicole. As Nicole mentioned, Matthew Shop with Zimmer Biomet. I've been with Zimmer for about 3 years in a few different roles, all in business development and ventures. Currently, I lead our sports extremities trauma business development and ventures, where we are roughly a $2 billion business segment growing at over 8%. Doing deals all the way from a couple $1 million venture investment to a over $1 billion acquisition with the latest one this year, Paragon 28. I've been in medical devices for a little over 15 years, almost all of it in business development, strategy, ventures, corporate development type work.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Next up, we've got Bjorn Mehta from Johnson & Johnson MedTech.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, my background is not too different than Matthew's. I've been in MedTech my entire career. I've spent the last 17 years at Johnson & Johnson. And in that, I've had two major roles that I think will be relevant for our conversation today. I've spent my first 14 years doing business development, M&A for a number of our MedTech businesses. And the last 3 years, I've been in JJDC, which is our corporate venture capital arm. I'm a vice president of venture investments. I lead investing in West North America. And JJDC is a strategic investor. It's been around for more than 50 years, very active in the medtech space. And happy to share with everyone today my learnings.
Thanks, Bjorn. And then lastly, on our partner side, Virginia Giddings from Edwards Lifesciences.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Nicole. It's great to be here today. It's great to be with this panel. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm Virginia Giddings. I'm with Edwards Lifesciences. This way of background, I'm technical by training. I have my PhD in engineering and worked my way up through R&D, but also had a mix of business development kinds of roles along the way. Currently, I'm VP of Exploration at Edwards. And that role is maybe a little bit different than some of the conventional business development roles. My team is very technically focused, and we're out there looking for the kinds of opportunities that would be great matches for future business that we're building. Some of you may know Edwards. Unlike many of the large med tech companies, we are very, very focused. We're focused on structural heart. So in some ways that can make my job maybe a little bit easier than some of the other folks in business development. So again, looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.
Thanks, Virginia, and good to have that targeted focus. So Matthew, Bjorn, and Virginia have all been really strong partners of MedTech Innovator, even mentoring companies that have been through our program. If you aren't super familiar with MedTech Innovator, we bring the best of the best startups through about 4 or 5 month accelerator program, about 4% admin rate, so really competitive to get in. And so really happy to be joined today also by a 2-time alum of this program. So not only has she been through it once and then actually had her company acquired, but then she went through it again last year with her new startup. So welcome, Jennifer Freed. Would love to hear your background as well.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Freed. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Flow Medical, where we are developing a catheter-based solution to treat pulmonary embolism. As Nicole mentioned, I've been privileged to go through the MTI program twice. My first company was a surgery software platform called Explorer Surgical, which we sold in 2021. And I spent pretty much my whole career in early stage med tech. Prior to founding my first company, I was a VC on the West Coast, so have seen this on multiple sides of the table, and it's really great to be here with everyone today.
Thanks, Jennifer. I love having your perspective on this. Yeah, I think that both sides of the table will be really important here, and knowing how to negotiate and win as we talk through, how to navigate these often tricky strategic partnerships. So for those of you listening on LinkedIn, I have some questions I'm going to work through with the panelists, but if you guys have something that comes to mind, please put it in the LinkedIn event comments. So our fantastic Gabby from our marketing team is going to be getting me those on the side. So if you have anything, we'll try to tackle those in the last about 10 minutes or so. So please utilize the live aspect of this. And for the cohort, as you guys know, please put your questions into the Q&A box. We'll be tackling those after the live portion is ended. So we're going to be talking today about the full spectrum of partnerships. So first, how do you start building these relationships and actually engaging with the strategics in the space? Then we'll move into, what are the priorities of these strategics and how do you time certain asks and relationship aspects? We'll move into deal structure and terms. When you start moving into potential M&A activities, what should this look like? What terms should you not include? And then we'll end with some potential risks, red flags, and lesson learned from these amazing folks. So it should be a great overview of the entire space. But to start things off, talking about building relationships, maybe we'll start with you, Jennifer. So what are some best practices for engaging strategics early and cultivating a relationship over time? So you've, had these two startups. What does this look like for you?
I think it really comes down to build relationships early and often. So when I was selling my first company, there wasn't a single management presentation where I was meeting a prospective acquirer for the first time. These were all people that I had built relationships with for years. And building my second company, prior to making the decision to join, I actually started calling strategics. And so I called a half a dozen cardiology companies and asked them, what do you think about the pulmonary embolism space, right? Where do you see this going? What are the inflection points? How would you think about this? Because fundamentally, most MedTech companies are going to exit via acquisition, right? You should still be thinking about commercializing and building a great standalone entity, but you have this fiduciary responsibility to your investors. So you do want to make sure that what you're building is something that is in a market that I think is acquirable. So it's building those relationships, and then I think coming up with the value inflection points that you're going to create along the way. So it's helpful for acquirers to not just see, a single point in time, but be able to follow a line. So you can reach out to somebody and say, hey, I'm thinking about building in this space. These are some of the concepts that we're working on. Is it okay if I touch base with you in 6 months to talk about some of our early benchtop work? Okay, well, let's do that. Now I'm planning on following these regulatory strategies. So you're able to really keep everybody abreast, and you're also able to understand where those companies are in the space, and they can be valuable in so many more ways than being an eventual acquirer or giving capital, because they are there in the trenches looking at these spaces, every single day.
Super helpful. Yeah, I love the aspect of building this as a true partnership and identifying those value inflection points and timelines side by side along with them. Would love to hear on the strategic side of things how you guys think about this. So Virginia, maybe you have some examples of some early stage strategic deal structures that help pave the way for eventual acquisition or other activities.
For sure. Yeah. And I think, Jennifer, you covered all the really relevant points, starting early, defining, the next check-in and the fact that that you can get really meaningful strategic guidance from strategics who play in space. So I think that hits on all the key aspects. Often when I'm working with companies, and in particular ones that maybe aren't as experienced, they're thinking of it as very sort of episodic, how they interact with us, where the episode is defined by a financing round. And I think I would challenge everyone just to think of it as more sort of a continual kind of relationship, which, oftentimes we will take a look at a technology and we will say, hey, no, not now. It's not the right timing. And we really mean it. Like if we were, when technologies are not a strategic fit for us and we're not interested, we will let you know. We're really busy. So we aren't able to spend a lot of time following up with companies if we're not really interested. So if you hear that message of no, not now, don't be disappointed. I know you need to get your companies funded and everything like that, but really it's just not now, but in the future, keep in touch and we would be interested. So I was going to give an example of this. And actually, it was a company Edwards was introduced to, I think, 2014, 2015, which was Endotronics. And it came in through MedTech Innovator, was one of the companies. And so we formed a relationship with them. We ended up making an investment, sitting on their board. Eventually, like many years later, this resulted in a structured deal, and we acquired Endotronics last year. So these relationships are very, very long term. I know it can be frustrated when you need to have that money to fund you to the next milestone, but it can truly be worthwhile for those investments.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. Super helpful to see that side of things and how you guys think about putting those pieces together. And bringing this back to, your comment about these companies need to raise money. A lot of times in parallel, they're also talking to investors. And we just finished our fundraising series with VCs and also folks on the non-dilutive side of things. So how should startups communicate with these strategics differently than they may already be communicating with traditional VCs or private investors? So Biren, maybe you'd like to speak to this.
Yeah, so first of all, these are different conversations. So there are some commonalities between talking to a financial VC and a strategic, but the differences are quite apparent. So with a financial VC, you're going to emphasize things like your financial metrics, your growth potential, eventually what types of returns they could get, what are the exit options. These are things that are not top of mind. They're not the highest priority for strategics. So strategics are more interested in understanding things like, how does your technology or your product fit into our strategy? How does it help us solve perhaps a pain point that we're feeling currently in the market? Or how does it help us see potentially how some type of integration or co-development could lead to something much greater for the industry? And in a lot of spaces, strategics have ecosystems. And so if you have a technology that can plug into that ecosystem and increase the value of the entire offering, that's going to be very interesting to the strategic. So my advice here would be, when you're approaching a strategic about your company, do your homework to understand in a ton of detail what's going on with them in that space right now, and try to understand why it would make sense for your technology to plug into their offering or into their technology or ecosystem, because that's how you're going to get their attention. I can remember one example. This was back just before COVID, 2019. I was at a cardiovascular conference, and I was in the business development role. And typically, when the business development folks go to conferences, their schedules are stacked. They have them beforehand. It's like back to back to back to back. And you're just meeting a bunch of people. And you've already said no to probably more than half the people that requested a meeting, but you've taken the ones that make sense and you're full. And I ran into a guy at the conference, and he got my attention for just a few minutes. And he explained a technology that we were in, but we were very strong in it. And it was an area where we were very strong and we were very well positioned. So, but because it was in our area, I found a way to take a meeting with him. And I remember, I can picture it now, we were on the conference floor in a meeting room, just the two of us in, the noisy conference room, conference floor, but speaking very confidentially. And he explained why his technology should be important to me and to our business. And it completely made me think about things differently, about how this market was going to shape up. Eventually, that was in, I think, May of 2019. Eventually, from meeting that company that day, we acquired that company about 17 months later at the end of 2020. And it just shows how, when somebody comes prepared to the conversation to help you understand why their technology is going to fit in with your overall offering, it can do wonders. So do the legwork, prepare for those meetings, and come in and help the strategics understand how your technology fits in with their offering.
That's a great example, and love this theme around doing your homework, knowing what products are already in their portfolio, how you can be complementary. But at the same time, sometimes these strategics have competing products in a similar area. So Virginia, would love to hear from you from this. In general, like how communications should differ, but also if that strategic does have a competing product in that area, what should these companies do to sort of target their conversation around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple of different aspects, and it's a great question. There's the whole aspect of the competitive concern, so we can talk about that. And then there's the aspect of sort of why would they invest in if they've got, and so that's sort of the differentiation part of it. So I mean, to start with the competitive piece, and there's there's like a perceived issue and there's a real issue. So there's both going on. So often when you're speaking to a company, you'll be talking to somebody who's in more of a business development kind of role. So typically they would not be sitting in the base business. So in terms of there being a concern about sort of the proprietary nature of what you're disclosing, most big companies have really good mechanisms to deal with that. In Edwards, I sit actually it's a business unit, advanced technology, but it's not a revenue business unit. So we actually don't have products. I don't interact with our base businesses or internal projects on a day-to-day business. I'm actually walled off from that, and I can't disclose what I learn in the outside world. I can't disclose that internally to any of our R&D organizations. So we keep a very strong wall up there, and that's as I said, it's both for the actual conflict, and there's there can be an optics issue there too. So that's how we deal with that. And then there's the, hey, they're playing in the space, and Baron spoke to that, with J&J, why would they be interested in? And I think that's really knowing it's not the broad strokes of the market. Like, it's not about like, hey, we're playing in this, $10 billion heart failure space or whatever. It's what patient you're actually targeting specifically. And then is that a patient that Edwards already is working on a product for? And so really trying to understand that, or how your product is differentiated from what we might already be working on. And not only how is it differentiated, but how do you own that differentiation? And that's a really critical piece, because that comes down to the IP, the know-how, et cetera. So you need to have a point of differentiation or be addressing a different population, and then that kind of differentiation needs to be protected and proprietary to you in some way.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I love that, focusing on the differentiation, whether that's a specific population type or some aspect of your technology. In MedTech Innovator, we're really strong on our value that we put together for our stakeholders. And so essentially we have all the companies go through a value program. And Jennifer was actually the winner of our value program last year in honing in on her value proposition for these different stakeholders. So I'm really glad that you brought that up, and so clearly she was able to differentiate to these folks, why they were unique for Flow Medical, and demonstrate that. So Jennifer, coming back to like this communication aspect, how has your communication differed when you're talking to strategic partners versus like traditional VCs? Are there certain milestones that you try to focus on, or parts of your value proposition that you try to focus on with them?
Yeah, there were excellent points that were brought up, and I think you have to tailor your message for the audience that you're meeting with, regardless of who that is, right? I speak to a financial VC the different way that I would speak to a strategic VC, and a different way that I would speak to a physician who's actively practicing in our space. And in addition to some of the specifics that Virginia listed, Another thing to think about is timing. So I think about for us in pulmonary embolism, we don't have a product in market today. We're bringing a product to market, in several years. So there may be a player that's in the space that's had a product for 15 years, and we could be a really good fit for them as a next generation, as we all continue to evolve the devices and technologies that we're bringing to market. When I joined Flow, there was an existing strategic investor. And I did have a little bit of pause on that because it's unusual to see a strategic involved at a pre-seed, at a pre-seed stage. And there's, of course, all of the thoughtful, legal due diligence you want to do. You want to make sure there are terms that are not restrictive. But I've actually found our strategic to be one of the most valuable investors I've ever interacted with in my career. And so I would encourage everybody to think about, working with strategics early on. And if you do decide to engage in a relationship, think about how you can get value from them. So we are working with a strategic that is, playing in our space. And that has been so helpful to us in everything from, thinking about our GLP study, doing early benchtop work. And I've made it a point to say, I want to interact with all of the different teams that are strategic. I want to be talking to Clin, I want to be talking to regulatory, I want to be talking to R&D. And there's so much value that can be provided. And so I think you need to understand how you fit in with the stakeholders that you're engaging with. But I also really believe that people in MedTech want to help each other. We're all here to take care of patients at the end of the day. And so if you can go to some of these conversations with asks, so even if somebody isn't funding right now, you might be able to say, hey, do you know really good GLP facilities that are set up to do these types of tests, right? Do you know specific conferences that people should go to? I think there's lots of ways that people in the ecosystem can help each other.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. I love that you mentioned bringing value in both directions. So also to them, thinking of how you guys can collaborate together on some of these milestones and actually, bring them maybe data they wouldn't otherwise think about, or a new type of way of looking at a new patient population. And so it seems like the theme so far is really building these relationships and, working toward, future M&A. This obviously plays a big role. So Matthew, would love to hear from you how much these softer factors like trust, team reputation, and responsiveness ultimately play into these acquisition decisions for the strategic.
Sure, Nicole. I think Byron mentioned he's been in medical devices for 17 years. I talked about over 15. I think, most people who are in these types of roles, whether on the VC or the strategic side, as well as the startup CEOs and employees, they tend to go into medical devices and stay in medical devices if they like it and if they're successful. And everyone's built a reputation, and it is a very, very small world, right? Where if you don't know the person on the other side directly from past experiences, it's not a 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's certainly no more than 1 degree away of knowing someone on the other side very well. And so the technical aspects, clinical, regulatory, all of that always has to be sound. But then it comes to a lot of these soft pieces where it is trust, reputation, responsiveness, where I tend to think of it, similar to how you'd be in a relationship with a partner, personally, where you're not going to just show up one day watching someone from afar and say, hey, I've been watching you for the last year. Would you like to marry me? It's something where you start small, you learn on both sides, certainly where you're talking about what as a strategic you're looking for, how you look, and then on the startup side's judging you as you build the relationship, and on the other side, the startup or executives there talk about their plan, and you have these check-ins and you see it develop and you see them hit their milestones that they've been trying to hit, and it builds more and more confidence the longer it goes on, and you get to a point where you do develop a certain inherent amount of trust and understanding, where in the past I've looked at companies where we may be on the fence as to whether or not we want to put an offer in, and trust and whether the company and the technology is going to continue to develop as the executives say it will, really comes to play and as a factor there in your decision making.
Yeah, that's
I'll
great.
add
Jennifer.
it goes both ways too, right? I mean, startup CEOs talk to each other about, to your point, Matthew, this is a very small community. So, if you're working with a partner and they do something that the startup doesn't like, that startup CEO is going to talk to other startup CEOs. And I'll say too, when I was selling my last company at the very last stages, there were two bidders, and I was, I think 37 or 38 weeks pregnant. So we really had to get our deal done. And I'm sitting there with our investment banker, and he's looking at me saying, Jennifer, who do you trust that is going to get this done in time? And the party that we chose, I had known the head of corporate development for over 5 years. And I just said, I know that this group is going to get it done. And so it comes in on all sides. And that's why I think we all need to, operate in an authentic, transparent, and honest way, because it will definitely come around.
Yeah, glad you brought that up, Jennifer. Startups talk, and that's why being part of a community like MedTech Innovator is so powerful as well, to know, on the other side who is good to work with and who might be a good fit. We've got all our companies in leadership pods where we encourage them to have the tough decisions with each other in these smaller settings. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Want to bring things back for a minute to starting to build this relationship and knowing really who to talk to in this. So, often if there is a clear complementary fit with a product already, in a certain business unit, it can be obvious who to reach out to. But curious, we'll start with you, Bjorn, like when a company is sort of between business units, how do you generate interest and avoid getting lost in the cracks between different people?
Yeah, so Nicole, this is a great question. I also noticed that we got a question on the live chat, so let me know if we want to take that as well. But it's a
Yeah, sure. If it's a cohort one, we can take them closer to the end. But I'll take a look at how it fits in. Yeah.
Okay. Fantastic. So yeah, this look, we're Johnson & Johnson deals with this all the time, right? We're a massive organization, and companies come to us and they don't quite fit in anywhere singularly, but there's a lot of logic to what they're doing to Johnson & Johnson. I'll give you some examples. One is someone has a drug device combo. Um, we have two major divisions in J&J, drugs and devices. We don't have a unit that's doing drug device combos. So if you take your drug device combo to the drug side, they're going to say, well, we're focused on drugs, and the device side will say we're focused on devices. And it's difficult to get some traction with a combination product. Another example can be that you have a solution for one area of the business. Let's say you have a solution in the vision space for AMD, but your solution is actually a neurovascular approach. It's not something the ophthalmologist is going to do. It's something that the neurointerventionalist is going to do. Now, in theory, J&J plays in both areas. We have a large vision business and we have a neurovascular business, but they're run separately. They have separate presidents. They have separate reporting lines. And so if you go to either one of them, they're going to conclude that it's not the optimal fit for their core. So that's a challenge. And so look, sometimes when things fall through the cracks, they should fall through the cracks. Like not everything that is in the middle is something that J&J is going to be interested in. But I think what we're trying to figure out here is what if you have something that really should be interesting to a J&J, but there isn't a single entity that's really ready to step up and take ownership of it. And first of all, it's a very hard question. And finding the right person to talk to in a big company is more than half the battle. And so what I would recommend if you have this situation is try your best to go high enough into the organization where the differences no longer appear. So for example, if you have a AMD vision therapy that needs a neurovascular approach, go to someone at the medical device level in J&J if you can get there. Now it's not so trivial to get there because this is more senior in the organization. But when you get to those levels, they stop seeing the differences between the business units. They see more the vision of how J&J can kind of change the paradigm, bring a new therapy to market, reach more patients. And then from that senior level, they can get some of the bottoms up type of support to evaluate it, to investigate it, to work across the businesses, get leaders together to evaluate different solutions. So I mean that to me is the best way to kind of get in with these fall through the crack ideas is try to get senior enough into the organization where the cracks don't appear at their level.
Yeah, great advice. Matthew, do you think this is true in Zimmer as well, like going higher above where the lines blur between business units?
Yeah, I think, every large company deals with this, right? No matter whether you're Zimmer, J&J, Medtronic, others, Edwards, others. I think also, and I think Byron and Jennifer spoke to this earlier, knowing who you're talking to and what they're going to be looking for, knowing your audience is so much of the battle as well, right? Where if you do have a product that sits across perhaps two different general managers and leadership, right? You don't want to go to the neurovascular GM and be pitching all of the benefits that it'll bring for ophthalmology. And you don't want to go to the ophthalmology GM and pitch the neurovascular benefits, right? So knowing and garnering that support of why it's important for their business, why it would help to drive them forward is critical and key. In addition to all of what Byron was talking about as well.
Yeah. Great. And then lastly, Virginia, would love to hear about you from this, like between the cracks, but then also on the other side, if there's something really revolutionary that doesn't fit into any existing business unit, how you approach thinking about that.
Yeah, so I think it can be really challenging for entrepreneurs. Companies are big and it can be difficult to find the right person in an organization. And at the end of the day, to get a deal done, you do need somebody who can act as like a business unit sponsor. Like what part of the business is going to be receiving and commercializing this product? And that's a very real challenge. Like how do you find that? For Edwards, I sit outside all the businesses. So, if it's like talking about Edwards, myself, my team are like, we're out there, we're the ones out there at meetings. So we're the ones that are visible. We can help to either it sits with us, which is, very new businesses for Edwards, or we'll identify the business unit that it should go to, and we'll facilitate and stay with that relationship and enable it. There's a lot of technologies that sort of cut across our different businesses, like things like robotics, AI, that would probably sit with myself, my group, to help to advance the technology. We have Edwards has centers of excellence for different technical areas, things like our valve material. It cuts across multiple businesses. So I think the thing is for entrepreneurs understanding that the person you may first identify to have a discussion with, maybe they're not the right person in the organization, but then I'd keep asking that question, like, is there a different person where there would be value to speaking with them?
Thanks, Virginia. Super helpful. We did get a couple questions rolling from LinkedIn on this topic, so I want to cover these before we move on. The first is, are there specific tools or templates that you guys use to determine vertical integration fit? And what makes you decide if something is a good fit or not? Are there specific metrics that you look for, calculations you make? Do you accept complementary technologies? Sounds like yes, but what really drives those decisions, and where do you see opportunities in the value chain in your units? So anyone want to comment on this? Byron, yeah.
Yeah, I can just say a few words on, we have and I think most strategics have this, but you have some type of a scorecard, and I don't mean it officially as a scorecard necessarily where every startup has a score, but we have to have some parameters under which we're consistently evaluating new opportunities. And in that scorecard, you have some of those consistent factors. So the things we're looking for to kind of determine strategic fit. So first of all, we try to understand end markets. So it could be a core space or an adjacency, but you're looking at end markets and you're trying to understand, is this the type of end market we want to increase our exposure to? You're looking at the size of the market, the growth profile of the market. What's the competitive landscape? How what are the barriers to entry for new entrants? So for example, if it's a market that's 510(k) driven, it tends to have a lower barrier to entry than the PMA ones. So these things are all factors to determine if a market is attractive. Then the next level, you look at things related to the company and you try to understand where are they trying to move the needle? Is it around something clinical like safety or efficacy, or is it around something more like workflow or cost? And that helps us understand where in the maturity of the market or the maturity of the company are we getting involved in? It's you tend to see more interest to invest in areas where you can show clinical differentiation. But as markets become more mature, that starts to fizzle out. And then companies are looking at ways to kind of show workflow or cost improvements. And so we try to understand where is a startup and how does that fit into where we think the market needs the most help in kind of addressing unmet needs. Finally, we look at things like economics. We look at so economics is critical because a lot of the strategics, when you start looking at go on Yahoo Finance and look at their financials, you start to see kind of what type of gross margin they need on a product in order for this to fit their profile. Because at the end of the day, company like J&J, companies like Zimmer, Edwards, we all have profitability objectives with our shareholders. And in some cases, we pay out the majority of our profits in the form of dividends. And so we cannot afford to compromise on profitability. And so we look at a space and say, is this an area where we can continue to generate the type of margins we need to not only satisfy shareholders, but continue to reinvest and stay competitive in that space? And then the last thing I'll say is when you're looking at like the fit, there's always a big question. I learned this early in my career, the three questions to ask about any particular target right at the beginning is, why do we want to be in this market? Why do we like this target? But the third question is, how are we going to create value? And this is where J&J tries to understand, like, what do we have today that actually allows us to disproportionately create value with this asset so that there's actually some benefit to shareholders. So if it's an adjacent space where we have no commercial presence, that's going to be a little bit more challenging because we don't get to leverage something. If it's a space where we're not going to leverage our ecosystem and get pull through of other products, it's going to be tougher. So one of the key questions is, how do we create additional value with the technology that you may have in your startup? So these are kind of the different metrics we look at across all deals to try to figure out what to prioritize and then how much to pay for something, for example.
Yeah, thanks, Bjorn. Super helpful. I hope whoever on LinkedIn that was helpful to them. But I love the access around, already having some benefit that could be complementary, whether that's, market access in a clinical space, patient access, sales, hospital distribution already in place for that clinical need. I think really, really helpful thing to think about. And second question we got from LinkedIn is, more coming back to the fundraising side as well. But how can these strategics help these early stage companies build relationships to access dilutive and non-dilutive capital from more traditional non-strategic investors? Some of you guys I know have your internal investment arms, but do you make introductions to other type of investors? Do you lead rounds? What are some examples of this? Yeah, Matthew.
Yeah, happy to jump into this. So I think the answer for most of us there, or most of us on the call, is probably all of the above, right? We invest, we can lead, we can join syndicated investment, or we can make introductions, right? So, back to what we were talking about with developing relationship, I think everyone on this call is probably more than happy, and I know I certainly am, to make introductions to different venture firms, right, where we know investors are interested in not just the vertical and the product technology, but the stage of the company as well, right? And that's one of the biggest conversations I've had with my mentee in MTI is, where they're looking to raise and understanding who might be a good match for them from a venture firm point of view, right? They're pre-revenue. They're not going to be going to a growth stage fund and they could, but it wouldn't be worth the time for them at this point, right? So where can they focus and understanding, not just the venture capital firms focus, but also where are they in their life cycles of their funds? Are they at the beginning of a fund and end of a fund? And where are they looking to deploy capital? So, these are things that strategics are happy to help with, right? Because it is an ecosystem that, we rely on companies to be funded and developed and then acquire them and continually over and over again. And it's a small world with good relationships across the whole ecosystem.
Yeah, that's great. And good that, you guys want them to win as well. So you're motivated to make those introductions in whatever way helps them get that funding to succeed. So thank you to those on LinkedIn who asked those great questions. If you have any more, continue to send those in. We'll tackle some more hopefully at the end. Moving a bit more to strategic priorities. So we'd love to hear first from you, Virginia, for founders that are trying to plan several years ahead, what can they do now to try to build their business toward a successful exit in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets back to what we kicked off with is building that relationship. I think, we're pretty, at least I'll speak for Edwards, we're pretty candid about what we're looking for. I mean, we can be very specific actually, since we are focused on the structural heart space and interventional cardiology approaches. I think, for the entrepreneurs, really knowing the strategics, first of all, knowing what they're looking for. I think it's pretty interesting. I'm heading off to LSI next week in London. And, many companies that sit in my space or in the Edwards space are reaching out to me. But then, I'm also getting reach outs from, other companies, neuro companies or urology companies. And I feel like, sort of just doing your basic homework of like which strategics would be interested in you, and we're often out talking about what would be of strategic interest, and then forming those relationships sort of early and often, right? And that's just going to facilitate an endpoint down the road if you can get input, strategic guidance. For your first in human, what endpoint are you going to look for? What patient population are you going to target? Then moving on to your EFS, and certainly your pivotal. If you're going into a pivotal and have an idea and you're doing a PMA device, it's really important to know that your potential acquirers would find value from those endpoints that you're defining for that pivotal. That's a ginormous investment, right? Which could all be wasted if you get through your pivotal, meet your endpoint, and no strategics care about that. So I think, really, and I think most strategics, and certainly if they're investing in you, they're going to give that kind of guidance. And at least from where I sit in this world of pretty complicated cardiology PMA devices, that's absolutely important towards a successful exit. I would say, for us, sort of clinical is king in a sense. Getting that right is really, really critical. There's a lot of other things like how you do product development, design controls. I mean, nobody wants to remediate a quality system. It's not fun, but like there's just nothing worse than having to repeat a pivotal trial because you didn't get that right.
Yeah, great advice. So listen to the strategic. Sounds like there's no one magic recipe of what is going to make you that most appetizing target, but it will differ on what their taste is. Would love to hear from you, Jennifer, as well on this. And what have you done to prepare for M&A and listen to the strategics?
I mean, I think we've talked about so much of this already, but one new party that we haven't talked about as much are investment bankers. And I would encourage all the startup CEOs to build relationships with the MedTech investment bankers because they are a wonderful source of knowledge around activity of who's interested in the space, what are combo roles really going to look like. They're also interested in building long-term relationships. There are some wonderful bankers out there who also create really informative reports and content. And so I would encourage everybody to know who the bankers are and also who the analysts are in their space that can help them stay up to date on where is this market going, what do we see range of exit options being, what are the value inflection points where we're seeing the strategics actually want to come in and acquire something. So I would encourage everybody to think about them as well.
Yeah, great aspect to have on your radar. And yeah, maybe we should have a session about that in the future as well, around bankers and what their thoughts are on the landscape. Typically when people are thinking about M&A, they think there is one goalpost in mind that they need to reach before they start these conversations. But, how far along really in clinical development or commercialization do these companies generally need to be before they start to attract meaningful strategic interest? Again, does this depend on the strategic, or are there specific ARRs or traction that you guys are looking for? So Viren, maybe we'll start with you on this.
Yeah, so this is probably the answer everyone would expect, is there is no magic recipe here for what milestone makes sense. But to put perspective around how strategics look at it, and they do have strategics, I think, have a systematic way of looking at things from their side, but from the outside, you may not be able to understand that system. But, a lot of times what we do in big companies is we're really trying to manage risk. And when you look at the development process of a MedTech startup, there's a lot of risk, but you can put them in some key buckets, right? So there's first the technical risk. Like, can this company design a device to do what it's intended to do in a safe way, in a workflow that could be scalable? That's step one. Step two would be clinical risk. Like, does this device actually help patients in a meaningful way that then it's worth scaling? And so that's the second. And the third is finally commercial risk. Is someone going to pay for this? Will physicians adopt this? And depending on what type of company you have and what space you're in, there's a different weighting of these risks. Like you may have something that proves to be clinically effective, but there's still a lot of questions on adoption. And there's markets like that right now that we're seeing, and a lot of strategics are on the sidelines waiting to see, are physicians really going to adopt this, even though there's already clinical data to look at. And so I think every deal will be different, but we're looking at risk along the way. And I would say in general, we tend to move earlier on things if they are core to our business. So if we're already in a space and it's something that is going to be a tuck-in technology, potentially disruptive, we are likely to move earlier. If integration of that technology into our offering is key, it also makes sense to sometimes move earlier because integration takes time. And sometimes you want to get that integration in before you might run a pivotal study, for example, because you will get better outcomes. When you get it to market, you'll get better adoption. So if some of these criteria are there, we're more likely to move earlier. And if it's on the other extreme, if it's an adjacent space, we're not well positioned there. We don't have the call point there. It's a space we may want to enter down the road, but we're not going to be able to leverage a lot of what we have. On something like that, we would probably look to go later. And when I talk about earlier or later, I'm talking about both on the investment side, but also the M&A side. So there are investments we will do pre-first in man. And this is because it's a core space and we want to be very close to this and potentially even think about taking them out earlier in the process, maybe even before a pivotal study. And then there's other investments that will tell them, like, we need to get closer to approval before we would even invest in you. Because with our investment, we want to see what happens commercially, because that's the risk that we're trying to address before we would potentially onboard the company. So there's a method to the madness. It's just pretty hard to figure out from the outside.
Yeah, makes sense. And Matthew, assume you guys agree with this, very vertical and company dependent on where you guys want to get in value wise. But, alongside this, how do you guys navigate situations where there's maybe multiple strategics interested at once in the business?
Yeah, I think a lot of that question comes up a lot, right? And I know there's companies that Barron's invested in at J&J and we're invested in at Zimmer Biomet, and there's other corporates invested in as well. And you might have two strategics on, not just on the cap table, but on the board with voting or board observer seats. And I think it's a concern that comes up a lot. But frankly, if you trust the strategic and you trust the person representing the strategic, it gives you multiple points of view, right? And it gives you multiple perspectives on how you might be able to approach a problem that comes up, or there might be a slight difference of what J&J is looking for compared to what Zimmer is looking for and compared to someone else. And so it's helpful. I think, there's, with involvement from strategics, it's not necessarily you don't want to have multiple strategics involved. It's just in which way are they involved with your company, and what rights are you giving to them, and are you giving them something that you will be a limiting factor down the road in other strategics or other financial investors' interest in your company.
Yeah, great segue into talking as well about rights in
Nicole,
terms
I
of
would
Virginia.
I would just add to this. I think so it does happen with multiple strategics. And from a strategic perspective, I'll say that it's non-ideal, and that can limit whether a strategic enters into funding, financing, all of that. So I would say just like proceed really with caution and be thoughtful about who your strategic partner is, because that could limit you in the future, sort of depending. And absolutely the thing about like rights, being like really careful, because that can lock you in. And then if things change for that strategic down the road and they don't move forward, that cannot look great for your company. So I would just say, I would urge sort of like, yeah, you can have multiple strategics, but I would just be very careful about how you proceed with that.
Yeah, and I think Virginia, I'm glad you brought up that point, because when you're a startup, you often think there's only upside to having multiple strategics. You say, well, if I have two strategics on my cap table, first of all, everyone's going to be more impressed by me, other investors, because they're going to be like, wow, you have two that are interested, and that almost suggests that when it's time to exit, you're going to have a bidding war. And so it's like it's very natural for the startup CEO to be like, that's my goal. And I think all that is true, but there is a trade-off. And the trade-off, it depends on what is it you want from your strategics. If you are looking for something more from your strategic, but they're not the only one on your board, you may not get it. If you're looking for access to their expertise, if you're looking for some potentially doing something with them on distribution or co-development, they're going to be much more guarded in how they want to partner with you, because they realize you have another strategic on the cap table who is essentially going to benefit from everything you're giving them, and eventually might win out in a bidding war. And so you're going to be more guarded. So the startup needs to decide what is it they're looking for from a strategic, and by having multiple strategics, is that going to put that at risk?
Yeah. And having two voices at the table does not mean you get twice the input that you would with one strategic. It may be actually less than one, because because now the strategic that's on your board is in a competitive situation. So actually the amount they might be willing to guide and give you input is going to be, greatly reduced, because this asset could end up in the hands of a competitor.
A really good point. And so, brings up the question, are there appropriate terms, especially for some of these early stage partnerships and financing that combine like the corporate investment with distribution rights and potential future acquisition options? Like, what should startups watch out for? Are there red flags in terms of terms around distribution, licensing, co-development that they should try to avoid? So, Bjorn, we'll start with you on this.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon that when a strategic puts an investment, they are going to look for some type of right, like a distribution. A distribution right is pretty common. We will do those often at the same time. We put the investment, we take the distribution right on the same day, same kind of transaction. In my opinion, first of all, I believe these agreements should stand on their own. So the investment agreement and the distribution agreement should stand on its own, meaning they should both be fair and attractive based on market terms. And what I mean by that, for example, if I was going to invest in a company, but then I'm going to sign a distribution deal where they give me a really attractive transfer price, that to me now is no longer standing on fair terms. I want to get the transfer price that reflects what the market will bear and see if that's attractive enough on the distribution deal. And I want to invest at market investment terms. So that's just, I think, a principle in terms of how to do these things to keep it very clean, but also make sure that it's fair to the shareholders of the startup. Now, I do think sometimes distribution rights can make sense for a startup who's thinking about whether to give them. First of all, it could provide the strategic with a deeper sense of diligence that actually might help them fully value your startup. Like if there's eventually going to be some value gap in an M&A, having the strategic experience, the distribution piece, might help them fully value it if you believe there's more there. For the startup, it could actually be a more cost-effective commercial strategy because building your sales force from scratch can be very expensive. Putting this in the hands of a strategic could help. But at the same time, if you put all your eggs in one basket, you give your strategic exclusive rights worldwide, and things don't work out, well, you're kind of screwed. You'll be in a tough position. You'll be tainted because people will say, well, how come that strategic didn't end up buying you? You won't have any other strategic that wants to step in and kind of take over. And so you might be in a tough spot. So I think there's ways to balance this. You might think about doing a regional deal with the strategic so that they can get their diligence experience in a region, but you have not given them the whole, global rights. You might think about doing a co-exclusive deal or an agency agreement, something that helps the strategic get more experience, but you have not given, your full destiny away to them. And balancing that so that in case they lose interest, and look, strategics can lose interest for a lot of reasons that are unrelated to you. Strategies change, leaders change, and all of a sudden they're no longer interested. You ideally don't want to have a situation where you put all your eggs in their basket, they lost interest, and now you're in a really bad. You need a way to recover. So, please plan for scenarios where things don't work out and make sure that you're not betting the entire company on a strategic.
Yeah, many things to think about in these negotiations. Thanks, Baron. Very insightful. Matthew, do you have any thoughts on this as well? What are appropriate terms or how to negotiate these?
Yeah, I'd say for the startups, understand what is the true value that you're developing and what is the value of your company? What are investors going to want? What are acquirers going to want? And then, think through the scenarios and game out, are the relationships you're entering into with strategics, is it benefiting that value and bolstering it, or is it potentially putting it at risk down the road? So, very much to what Byron said, there are ways to work together without, putting the future value at risk. But you need to think about it and you need to game it out.
Great. Don't have a ton of cohort submitted questions yet, so we'll extend the live part a bit. So the rest of LinkedIn.
Yeah, so Nicole, just to add to that, like anytime you enter into like a legal agreement, just in general, it's an obligation, and that's something that a potential investor or a potential acquirer is going to need to look at and see, will it work for them? And it's just sort of it can be really hard to get deals done. And so I think just being very, very thoughtful, like there are times where maybe you have to do a distribution agreement or whatever kind of agreement to keep the company going and to move ahead, and you'll need to do that. But realize that could be something that down the line, well, for sure down the line, if somebody's acquiring you, they're going to take a look at that and they're going to say, is that attractive for us to acquire that company, given that they have this legal obligation already in place, and just really gaming it out and getting good advice about and really thinking through how it could play out down the road.
Yeah, great advice. Bringing in a third party maybe to determine if this term is fair to a future acquirer or not. And so thinking of some other like red flags, lessons learned, Jennifer, I'd love to hear from you from your experience. What are some common things that could derail M&A at the last minute? Maybe even things outside of your control.
I have so many horror stories from friends and peers over the years. So, I mean, ultimately, a deal isn't done until it's fully done. I had friends had deals fall apart during COVID. I had a friend whose deal fell apart over a very, very minor HIPAA violation that then caused an investigation. We've seen acquiring company CEOs get fired. We've seen macro, environment things happen where it tumbles the acquirer's share price or tariffs or all of these types of things. So, there are so many things that are out of your control in these final stages. And this is only a fraction of, my investment banker friends and their stories of what's happened. So, I think you always want to have, your plan B and your plan C, even in these final stages. So even if you think your company is getting acquired, prior to commercialization, you still better have your own commercialization plan and what you want to do in case that changes. And then, the deal isn't done until you've actually seen that money hit your bank account, out of the escrow, but in your bank account, that's when the deal is finally done.
Yeah, great advice. So, think of all these other factors. There's so much going on in this current macroeconomic and political landscape. And you guys have spoken already to some of these risks that you're weighing when considering these acquisition decisions. But, with particular respect to this climate, are there specific regulatory or reimbursement risks that could weigh heavily in acquisition decision making, especially in the current climate? So do you have advice for these startups to try to make these tough decisions when navigating this? So Virginia, we'll start with you on this.
Yes, there are a ton of risks, of course. So yeah, I don't know what else to say besides that, honestly. There's I mean, it's more than, I guess it's a regulatory, but it's like the SEC and all of that can become, there's a lot of risks out there. So as a startup, I just think it's getting the right guidance, understanding those risks. Like certainly things like payment is really, really important. But I think something like that we would know about pretty far in advance, and so that's not something that's going to derail a technology last minute. But yeah, I think it's you got to understand your risk matrix and how you're mitigating those different risks. And then there's some things like the SEC that can be just maybe a little bit hard to predict.
Yeah, definitely hard to predict, and changes with CMS, all that type of stuff as well. Matthew, would love to hear from you about this, and especially we've got a webinar coming up next week around the Class 2 conundrum, so 510K versus de novo. So, weighing the different risks of going down those two pathways. How should companies think about that?
Sure. I think a lot of it is, with different verticals and different classifications of devices, there tends to be a more or less a standard of this is what's expected to get approval for your type of device and your classification of device. It's good to understand those norms. And I'll say, if you're a company trying to get your device put into a different classification, perhaps for a speed to market, it's fantastic, but know that that does increase the level of risk that there is for your device, right? So, being the first person to move from a Class 3 to a Class 2 device for a certain product may sound great, and you may think, I'll be the best CEO in the world if I can get my company to do this, but it does increase the level of risk, and it might be potentially faster to market, but it also could mean that you fail and you have to start over then with generating clinical evidence, and you've wasted time getting to market. Also understanding that getting to an FDA approval is not necessarily the only thing that you need for your company to be successful. So an example would be if there isn't current reimbursement for your device, right? Getting a single arm study de novo with clinical evidence probably isn't going to get you the evidence that you need to then be able to file for reimbursement. And so you can get to market faster, but you're still going to need to do level of investment beyond to where you'll have a fully reimbursed product. and reimbursed procedure. So, understanding just, again, what's an acceptable level of risk for the type of device that you have, what's the most balanced approach to risk reward or risk and cost. Really, it can be important to think through all of those pieces and not just think, I'm going to get fastest to market because that's what's most important.
Yeah, great to mention, like, there is the timeline to market, and there is a timeline that's best for your product and adoption as well. And, a lot of people see that regulatory approval as the end of the tunnel, and it really isn't. You have to think about adoption, and if there are pathways, claims, you can think about that, maybe force you to go down this different pathway, but will ultimately end in more adoption. Virginia, more? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, you can have different kinds of investors at the table, right? Maybe a strategic, maybe a few strategics, maybe some venture investors. And what we're looking for can be fundamentally different. Like some investors, they're really looking for, commercializing as quickly as possible to get revenue. Whereas like most strategics would be looking at, maybe the quickest to market might not be the most important thing. It's how do you access the most patients, and how do you like get to like your commercialization revenue stream that you're looking for. And so those can be different objectives. And for us, something that really factors into it is, at the end of the day, is the quality of the clinical evidence, not just from the perspective of achieving your FDA approval, which is important, but also from the perspective of accessing the market, and having compelling evidence that, the clinicians that will help to drive adoption. So I think, if you're playing in the PMA area, this becomes really important. So it's just something for you to be aware of, that you may have that tension between the nearer term investors who are much more focused on the nearer term, and then investors like strategics that are further out, and thinking through how you balance that. I don't have an answer to it, right? But I think you do need to be aware of that dynamic.
Yeah, very, very good point. Awesome. So moving to the end here, we will have one more question, which I think ties in well. Someone on LinkedIn, also asked about recommendations for startups that need to raise capital to go through approval to market. But, want to know advice on that maybe, but importantly also, what are some avoidable mistakes that startups make when raising these rounds on their pathway to market and eventually M&A? So Bjorn, we'll start with you. What are some of these big mistakes?
Yeah, so I saw an interesting statistic yesterday, which I'll share. It showed that the time it takes to go from your first VC round for a PMA device, on average, the time it takes to get to an M&A exit is almost 9 years. The time it takes to get to an approval is almost 10 years. So that means on average, the exits are happening just before approval, which makes sense. And the time that it takes for companies to get to an IPO, the ones that do go to IPO, is 13 years from the first VC round. So it's a long journey. And so I think my answer to this question is startup mistakes. I'll kind of say two things. One is choosing your investors carefully. Choosing your investors, especially your board members, that are going to shape the company and make critical decisions is really important. And if you don't have if your investors aren't sharing the same long-term view, you're going to hit a lot of challenging roadblocks. And in some cases, it could ruin the company from the founder's perspective because they had a different vision and they have a group of investors who want to take it a different direction. So not every dollar is equal. I think when you're raising money, look at where the money's coming from, understand what their interests are, what their expectations are. Some investors are just tuned to like massive step ups in valuation quickly, and that's all they want to push for. Other investors are more patient and wanting to, for the long run. And if it takes longer to build the right company, they're willing to wait it out and put more money in. So you just know what you're getting. And then the second thing I'll say is that when you're raising money, you might come across situations where it's not so obvious. So, for example, you might get a regional investor. I'm going to give an example. You might get a Chinese VC that wants to invest in you, but they also want to take exclusive rights in China, right? That's a very common thing. And on the surface of it, you say, well, we weren't even focused on China. We were going to focus in the US, no harm done. They're gonna actually pay for the study in China. So let's take their money and let's do it. And in the moment, it sounds very attractive. And if you haven't thought through the next few steps, like if a strategic comes along one day and wants to acquire me, what are they going to think about the obligation I've just made to this Chinese VC? Most likely, I think the strategics on this call will probably agree, we're global companies. And if we're going to invest big in something, we are going to want to control its global rollout, its global reputation, its global messaging. And so if there isn't a way to get those rights back, it's going to be a problem. So start thinking ahead about those steps. And what you might do is you might still take money from the Chinese VC and you might provide them the rights, but you should work in a way to reasonably buy back those rights so that eventually if someone buys you, a strategic wants to buy you, they can see a path to getting global control again. And it should be at a reasonable price because whatever that strategic's going to have to pay to that to get those China rights back is going to come out of the purchase price, right? Like they cannot justify paying above and beyond. So whatever you've negotiated there is really going to come out of your own pocket. So think about these things carefully, kind of when you're signing up for them, because they will come back eventually.
Great advice, Baron. Yeah, look at who's on the cap table. Matthew, what advice do you have? Some avoidable mistakes, especially when raising rounds.
Yeah, I just echo what Baron was saying, and I was thinking it before he said it, just based on the conversations that we were having. I've seen startups who have had potential financial investors and have been fortunate enough to choose between multiple term sheets with lead investors, where the financial investor may have offered slightly better terms, one financial investor A, but they did want a board seat, and who they were going to be putting on the board was someone who really didn't add any value, right? And they ended up going with financial investor number 2, who had a well-regarded surgeon who was going to be taking the board seat as representing those investors, but with a lot to offer, and a well-known perspective and well-regarded reputation to help the company, right? I've also seen where many startups have shunned what they've called big VC to try to raise small amounts from family offices, and just know that all the time that you're spending trying to raise little bits of money here and there is time that you can't spend doing the work to drive your company forward. And very often you end up with terms that are even worse or non-market, and make the future of your company much more difficult, just because they're family offices who want to add terms in that may be relevant for other industries and not really so relevant for medical device. So just focusing on making the right decisions, having the patience, building your network, and understanding what's considered market for different stages of your company.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Really helpful. And Virginia, do you have something to add on to this? What's your advice?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Baron and Matthew, you covered the whole financial piece like really well and comprehensively. Maybe the only other thing to say is like consider capital efficiency. And if you have spent a lot of capital going down sort of a path that's not fruitful, then the down round might be inevitable. So that's the only thing to add on the financial piece. I think as maybe to think about a different aspect is like really understanding the need that you're addressing. What is the patient? What is the need? How does that then distill down to how you run the clinical trial, what the endpoints are, making sure that whatever those endpoints are meaningful measurements of the impact that you are trying to achieve with that need. So that's, I think, a really critical piece in terms of these technologies. I see, a lot of companies sort of struggle with, what's the patient population, and they're already in clinical trials. So it's like really thinking through that whole continuum of the need translating into clinical evidence.
Thanks, Virginia. Great advice. And then finally, we'll end with Jennifer. So you've been there. What's your advice and some mistakes to avoid?
There's been such great advice that's been shared, and I think a lot of it comes down to just these fundamentals of governance. So having really good governance, understanding, who are going to control the big decisions that are being made in the future of the company. And I think also, when you bring on new investors, it's really healthy to understand what their expectations are for an exit. Because I have seen situations where founders are ready to sell, but some of the board members are not. And as you're bringing in different investors at different stages, later stage investors are looking for, less risk, but also, a lower multiple typically versus some of those early stage investors. And it's really important as you're getting that cap table together to really understand, hey, if I had an acquisition offer come in next month, who needs to vote yes? And for each of those parties, what are the terms upon which they would say yes? And it sounds so obvious to say it out loud, but I think a lot of founders and boards are uncomfortable, having this conversation. There's a book that I like to recommend called Exit Right. It was written by one of my peers who sold not a MedTech company, but a healthcare company. And what he recommends is this framework where once a year, you get together with your board and your executive team and you say, what do we think the most viable exit paths are, right? So who are the 6 great acquirers? How we talk to them? Do they know who we are? Where are they positioned in the space? But then also, what is the exit that we would consider taking today as a company? So it's not a conversation that you're having for the very first time when those unsolicited offers come in or something is a surprise. But you're all sitting down there saying, okay, the reality is we have a fiduciary obligation as the board to think about our shareholders. So what does the exit look like that we would take today? And then if people aren't aligned, then hopefully you can identify that before somebody signs on. And you've got that late stage investor that says, oh yeah, I'm coming in at this $300 million post-money valuation, but FYI, I'm not going to sell it unless you get a $900 million offer. So, it's just good to have those conversations up front so you can all go in and be thoughtful.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. Love that. Mapping it out early, knowing who's all potentially coming to the table and knowing what they want. So with that, I think that's great final advice to end our webinar on acquired taste. So whether you guys are building toward your first strategic conversation or positioning for an acquisition, I hope this session served up a plate of practical insights with a side of hard-won lessons to make your company the most appetizing target for that specific strategic investor in their business interests. So thank you all so much for those of you on LinkedIn for joining. Cohort, please stick around for some Q&A. And please join us next week for our next MTI Live on the Class 2 conundrum, the 510K versus de novo decoded pathways. So looking forward to seeing you all then. Thank you so much to Matthew, Biren, Virginia, and Jennifer for